All right, so this is the second assignment that I posted. This probably is not going to be nearly as work intensive as the first assignment, oddly enough, right? But it's also not nearly as exciting. This one it's unfortunate because just for the next this week and next week, there's just unfortunately no other way to do this than doing some drudgery assignments. The flip side is that these are either harder than questions you'll get on exam, or around the same difficulty. So some of the questions are around the same difficulty as what you get on the exam, and similar to the format you'd get on exam, or they're slightly harder. And the main thing that students have with this one is formatting these questions. So I'm going to go over that with you at the it's formatting these methods. Also note that this homework will be used in the next homework, because next week you'll be doing an analysis of the answers you give. Essentially like saying, okay, how efficient is the algorithm I just wrote here? That's what we'll be getting into for next week's homework. All right, so the main thing here is that what's different than we've learned, what you haven't learned yet, and what you learned for this assignment specifically, is writing static generic methods. So static methods that use generics, all right? Most of the methods you write in the class aren't static, right? It's actually the exception to writing a static method. The only assignment where I think we do that, other assignment where we do that, I think is sorting, but it's not really that bad. So let's go ahead and say we wanted to write a method called in, which is essentially the contains method, right? The contains method tells you whether an item is in a collection or it's not in a collection, right? True or false. So we're just writing one called in, which does the same thing, only it's not an instance method, it's a static method, right? So we're going to be given a list and an item, and we want to check if the list contains that item. And obviously for this, because we're dealing with generics, the item is going to be the same type that the list contains, right? We don't know what the type the item will be. We don't know what kind of stuff the list will have, but we do know that's going to change from one program to the other. So we want to write a method that can be used no matter what kind of list we have. So we want it to be generic. So if we write it like this, which I'll just copy into my IDE down here, and then I'll be working off of there, right? If I write it like this, and is that big enough, or do I need to increase the size for the people in the back? Smidge, right? I think what happened is that my IDE updated, and then it reset the sizes, possibly. Editor, font, or I don't think it's so much it's reset the sizes actually as that I just didn't increase the font size overall. Okay, better? All right, so here what it's saying is essentially I want a list that contains some type, which I'm designating E, right? It's a list of all the types that designate E, and it contains something as an item of type E. And Java says that's an error, right? It says it's an error. Specifically, what pops up, it says it cannot resolve it can't resolve the symbol E. That's what it says over here. It cannot resolve the symbol called E. And this is because that when you use generics, right, what it's saying is that essentially it's totally kosher to do something like this. To write something like this. Public static sum, public static in sum, which is going to take in a list of integers, okay, called list, and get the sum of the list, right? It's perfect, and I'll just return -1 here just simply to quash that error over there, right? It takes in a list of integers, and that's perfectly fine, right? You're allowed to declare that a method only takes in a list of integers, right? Make sense over there? So this method sum, it deals with only lists of integers, doesn't deal with lists of doubles, doesn't deal with lists of floats, doesn't deal with lists of longs, just deals with lists of integers, okay? So you're allowed to write a method like that. On the other hand, over here, so why are we getting an error here when I just say I want a list of E's, which is the symbol that I've been using for a while? Well, Java doesn't know what E is. It's assuming that you're meaning you wrote a class somewhere called E, and it can't find it. That's what it's doing here. That's why it says I can't resolve the symbol. It assumes that it doesn't know that you want to use that as the marker, right? That you don't want. It doesn't know you need to use that. You're trying to use that as the symbol for generic. So what you do, so it's a very easy thing to resolve. It just looks a bit wonky and intimidating, but all you do is between the static and the return type, you say, oh, if I want to use E as the symbol for the generic type, I put E here, right? And that's all it does. It's just saying all you're doing is saying this method, in this method, what this says is that in this method is a generic type. Its type is E. Now, you don't have to use E. You could put in whatever type you want. You can use T instead if that's your favorite letter. You could use K. Their popular letters are E, T, right? E for element, T for type. And then when we deal with hash tables, K for key, V for value. Right, those are popular, but we use E a lot here, so we're going to just use E. So, and now I can complete this method as normal. So I can just write, and I'm just going to write return false. I'm not going to bother implementing these, right? Because there's really not too much. But now since it's an E item, you can just simply, like, you know, the most you're going to know about item is that you're going to know it's an object. So you can't really do more than that. But for this method, yeah, I'll go ahead and implement it. That's all you need to know, right? For each E item in list, and I can't use item, for each, let's call it E element in list. So for every element of type E in the list, and the reason I have an E there is because we know it's a list of stuff. What type of stuff is it? It's a list of E's, right? If item dot equals, right? Because and I can do dot equals because E is guaranteed to be an object, because if it's using generics, then it's got to be an object, so it's going to have a dot equals there, right? That's part of the reason why you can't use primitives, because now we can guarantee that it has a dot equals. Item dot equals the element, right? If that is equal to the thing I'm looking for, if the thing I'm looking for is equal to the item I'm looking at right now, oh, great, this item is in the list, so I'm going to return true. Otherwise, I'm going to get to the end and I'm going to return false. Make sense? All right, and so I can create an array list down here, okay, and I'm just going to go ahead and add like list.add 1. Unfortunately, there's not really an easier way to create a list like this other than just to add the items you want. List.add, like I can add in all, let's see. I can add in all of an item, so let's see what we can do with that. Can I create an array of integers called int array? Yeah, let me scroll down so that people aren't craning their neck. Int r is equal to I'm just going to go ahead and just put in gibberish. Can I add in r there? No, I can't, because an array is not a collection, right? If it was another list, I could totally do it like that, but I can't do it like that here. So here, so there is an add all method, but otherwise to create the list, your test list, you're just going to have to do the annoying thing of adding all your items individually, or just create a for each loop, or sorry, a for I loop, right? For int I is equal to 0, I is less than 20, and then just simply add all those items, right? So if you want to create a list pretty quickly, that's what you want to do. And then I can ask, hey, in, right, Boolean b is equal to in list 4. So this will ask, is 4 in the list, right? And it'll store true or false in there. Now, notice that this is an array list, right? But the method takes a list, right? Well, this works because, remember, array list is a list, so you can put it in. So you can put it wherever a list would go, right? An array list is a list, so I can put it right here. Similarly, for the sum method, that's no problem. I can get the sum of the list, right? And I can pass an array list of integers in for a list of integers, because an array list is a list. So that works just fine. So that's how you write those methods. So the big key is, like, when do you use generics and when do you not? And so I've got a little paragraph about that. When you know you're dealing with a specific type, like a list of strings or a list of integers, when you know what the type of the list is going to be, just you don't need to use the generic indicator. You just simply say, hey, it's a list of integers, and that's perfectly fine. When you don't know what the type is, right? When you know you're just dealing with generics, that's when you and it could be any type. That's when you use E. So there's 6 methods, each worth 15 points. They're regardless of the difficulty, they're all worth the same amount of points, which is 15. Okay. Then you get 10 points for what's called neatness, right? Which is just making sure you right-click and hit the format code, or if you're in Eclipse, hitting Control A and then hitting Control I, which will properly indent all your code. And just making sure it's tight, neat, and tidy, and not instead resembling a mass of spaghetti. So the methods that to write are uniqueness, which takes in a list and returns true if all the items in the list are unique. They're unique if none of them are the same. How do we declare them being the same? Well, if 2 things match via the dot equals method, then they're the same. All multiples takes in a list of integers, return and an integer and an int or an integer, and it returns a new list of integers which contains all the numbers from here that are multiples of the input. So for example, if my list is this, and I give you 5, you give me all these numbers, which are all the multiples of 5 from the input list. It's always easier to explain this one with an example. Now, because this is a list of integers, you can return an array list instead. Because you can return an array list because it's asking for a list back, so you can return an array list. All strings of size returns all strings of the input size, so very similar to this one. Like for this one, if I give you this list, I like to eat apples and bananas, and 3, it will return eat, and, right? So you don't have to worry about duplicates for that one. Okay? Is permutation given 2 lists containing the same type? It returns true if the lists are permutations of each other and false if they're not. They're permutations if they have the same elements, including the same number of duplicates, but they don't necessarily have to have the elements in the same order. So 1, 2, 4 and 2, 1, 4 are permutations of each other, but not 1, 1, 2, 4. Those are not permutations of each other. Okay, this one is, there's 2 what I'll call harder ones. This is one of the harder ones. String to list. So given a string, converts it into a list of words. We assume that each word is separated by white space, and I'll give you the example here. So for example, if your input string is hello, comma, space, world, exclamation point, then your output is hello, because that's one item, hello, comma, and then the second item is world. So there's this nice method, by the way, that I mentioned in the footnote called the split method, which it's a string, you use it on a string and it returns an array of strings that are split up by a delimiter. So split by a pattern, essentially. So you can just simply use like split space or this thing that I give you over here. And I wrote on the board, you should learn regular expressions especially if you get done with this. And I might give an extra credit bit after this, just simply to get you guys to learn regular expressions because they're useful later on in the semester. They're never required for anything in this semester, but gosh darn are they useful to know. Okay, and finally, and this returns a list of strings. Finally, remove all instances given a list and an item. Remove all instances of that item from the list. So for example, if you're given a list of integers 1, 4, 5, 6, 5, 5, 2, and you want to test yourself on that, you want to test this one out on this example explicitly. An integer 5, the method would remove all the 5s from the list. It should return nothing since you're changing the input list. Much like if you change an array, you don't have to return the array. Note the footnote where it says that this one is extremely tricky because if you remove an item, the indices are going to shift. Okay, so you're going to have to keep that in mind. You'll want to write it, then run this before you come and ask me because it's very likely that you will have fallen into a small trap, and there's about 3 different ways to solve this one that are you can easily understand to go from one to the other, and then there's one other way there's like 4 different or 5 different ways to solve this that are 3 of which are highly related to another. So again, there's 90 points, 10 points, and then there's 5 extra credit points just baked into this assignment, which is described in the string to list of words, which is incentive for you to learn a bit about regular expressions. To demo this, come to me or the TA, and you'll be asked to explain how you solved remove all instances and show that it worked on that test case. and then one other method, one of the other 5 methods, which I'll just choose based on glancing at your code, what looks interesting to ask a question about. Okay, now is there anybody here today that doesn't have a computer to work on? Okay, so because this one's more of this one you guys can work together, right? But for this one, rather than this one, you're going to be submitting your own copy. So you can work with somebody else, but you got to submit your own copy and demo it yourself for this one. So, because I want you to collaborate, but this one is less of a group project and more of you can work together and ask each other for help kind of deal. So if you don't have a laptop, just work with somebody else as best you can.